Welcome to the Black Paper. My name is Ndukwe Onoha.
Chatawanze.
Chata, were you one of those kids that wrote back to school lists to your parents?
Nope.
Yeah. So you were one of I don't know whether to say the lucky or the unlucky, whichever way it was. At least you knew you didn't have your hopes up. You knew that whatever you got was what you were going to be given anyway.
So
Now,
basically, it was a case of my mom was very proactive in trying to find out what we needed, and she would go out of her way to get what we needed, and she made it clear that this is what you need, not what you want. And then don't forget that so there was only one time that I tried to do a wish list, and it wasn't written. It was I verbalized it to my father, and it happens during that ASU strike. I don't know if you remember. Towards the end of the 80s, there was one long ASU strike, and Babangida implemented that no work, no pay thing. So my dad didn't have money. So when I told him that, oh, I want this, I want this, I want this, he didn't say anything. But the look that he gave me was, I never did it again.
Well, the reason I bring that up is that the UK government is acting like parents whose kids have given them a list and they have no intention of approving it in its entirety. Last week, news emerged that the government is preparing to cut its contribution to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Now, the Global Fund is one of those most effective health partnerships in the world. And since 2002, it's helped save more than 70 million lives, providing medicine, mosquito nets, and hope in places where these things are in short supply. But just recently, charities are have started fighting back against these cuts. They warn that this latest round of cuts could lead to 300,000 preventable deaths and almost 6 million new infections. And what's ironic is this: the UK is actually hosting the Global Fund's next replenishment summit. So while they gather,
That's a stunning optics.
it is.
Yeah.
So while they gather people to talk about doing more through the funds, they are cutting down on their own contributions.
And I think it's the first time that a host country has ever cut its pledge.
It's the first. It is.
So way to go, UK. It's record breaking. I mean, you have to celebrate those small wins.
Now, the interesting thing is, and this is, I'm sure, is where you will even be very a lot more interested in this conversation. The government is going with the argument that the UK needs to increase our defense spending. But if you talk to many people, they will say that
I like the way you said
well, it is isn't it?
Well, you're a part of the government, so.
No, we're part of the UK.
But you are in the Labour Party, and you are an elected Labour Party person.
Labour, Cheta, we've gone like what 2-3 episodes without you. What happened? What has happened? Well, anyway, when you come down to the cross of this podcast, African heritage communities, a lot of them will tell you that these cuts aren't just about some faraway places. It's families, it's friends, it's communities, and in one way or the other, it's going to come back into the money we send, either to increase on. And I have personal experience with this. So, Cheta, what does Britain lose, if anything, and who pays the price when compassion becomes optional?
So I think it's so let me for a brief second move away from labor bashing
Thank you.
to point out that this cut is probably the second cut. There was a cut I think 3 years ago by the Conservative government. So both sides of the aisle are guilty. We haven't yet gotten to the point where the extreme sides of the aisle are in government to make cuts. Again, you pointed out, and I think it's important to point out that we've discussed this before. That they would have to cut to fund the increased toys for the military. We discussed it when we had JB, the former soldier, on to talk about it, and we've also talked about it in another episode. But at the end of the day, it's not just about charities or budgets. I think one of the problems is that too many people are no longer able to put abstract things like numbers in real perspective. So you talk of 300,000 preventable deaths which is what charities are warning, and I think almost 6 million avoidable infections. Um, we need to have people in power, in governments, who can put a human face on these kind of decisions, because ultimately, and this is where these guys are missing the plot. Ultimately, it comes around. There was a report that my organization did. Was it 3 years ago, 2 years ago, about rising costs of medicines in Nigeria.
Sorry, Sheta, before you go on, please plug. You keep saying my organization. Plug it properly.
SBM
What's your
Intelligence.
aha?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Um,
carry on. SBM
yeah.
Intelligence,
There
guys.
was yeah, there was an organization. There was an organization. There was a report that we did 2 years ago. Yes, towards the end of 2023. But it built up on a report that we did during COVID. And one of the risks of this kind of behavior, which the UK government, but I must say, they are leading off the Trump government in the United States, or they are feeding off, not leading off. One of the things that this kind of behavior does is it essentially creates laboratories. Um, so the nature of infectious diseases is this. These are organisms. It's organisms that cause these diseases. And when you leave these diseases to fester, they evolve. They become better. Those organisms become more adept at fighting the medicines that we use to treat them. So when you think of, as an example, those super bugs that you heard about in the UK years ago, these were diseases, and one thing that we must take into account is our own native environments, tropical environments, are very, very good petri dishes, because it's warm all the year round. So there's enough time for all sorts of organisms to evolve, to adapt. I think the word I should be using there is adapt, to adapt. So by reversing decades of progress, when you essentially defund the global fund, you are increasing the risk of plasmodium, which is the bug that causes malaria, as an example, evolving and adapting to fight. I'm sure you've noticed over the course of our lifetime, um, uh, when we were young, just simple chloroquine would cure your malaria. Now you have to use more of a cocktail. If you contract malaria, you have to use more of a cocktail. What does that tell you? It tells you that the bug that causes malaria has adapted to chloroquine. So the more you the more you defund eradicating these illnesses, as it were, the more you are giving room. And note that, using the malaria example, the population here in the UK is not as immune to malaria as the population, say, in Nigeria. So essentially, this is something which in the long term will come back to bite.
So, Cheta, in an increasingly um, inward-looking world, where countries are saying, and you hear this from all the different spectrums in the UK in terms of political argument. You hear it especially from across the pond in the US, where people are saying we have to look out for our people first. Um, and if we agree that one of the biggest threats right now is territorial expansions of whatever kind, whether it's Russia into Ukraine, or whether it's the response of Israel into Gaza, or whether it's even places like Sudan and the rest. People are saying to themselves, we do need to up our defense spending. I mean, interestingly, even the party that is most notorious for not wanting anything to do with war, which is a Green Party, is saying that, yeah, okay, well, maybe now let's still hang on to NATO. Let's take on this defense, the issue of defense. Why then, should a country devote more funds to helping, another country take care of its health issues when there are supposed enemies knocking at the door?
Because in the long term view, the health of the population is the ultimate form of defense. And one thing that people must remember is that borders between countries, regardless of how you cut it, are not natural creations. They are largely artificial. So the UK is the UK is an island nation, so its borders are natural. That's when you take Great Britain on one part, and then the Northern Ireland, or the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is just an artificial line in the sand, or let me rephrase, an imaginary line in the sand. So same way, I'll give a practical example from two borders that I'm very familiar with: the Nigerian border with with Republic du Benin, Seme, and the Nigerian border with Republic du Niger at Jibia. In both borders, you will actually see people's houses that are in both countries. I have seen pictures. So I've crossed the border between Belgium and the Netherlands before, but not at the point where there's a point where, and I'm sure you've seen those pictures, where there's a house. One part of the house is in the Netherlands, the other part is in Belgium. That tells you everything about borders. Borders are basically imaginary lines in the sand. So viruses, bacteria, pathogens that carry that carry illnesses that can debilitate whole populations do not respect those borders. Those borders are human creations. So when you allow a population somewhere, anywhere, and we have a very good recent example, COVID. Let us ignore the politics of where COVID started from and just assume that it would have been called the Wuhan virus, because it was in Wuhan, China, that it was first identified. But within a few weeks, it was all over the place. In Nigeria, the chief of staff to President Buhari, died of COVID. Where did he contract it? In Germany, where he went for meetings with Siemens because of work that they were doing on Nigeria's power grid. So essentially, late Abba Kyari could have been carrying, say, the malaria, or maybe a super malaria pathogen that he had contracted, but because of our native resistance to malaria, he would have carried it for a meeting with his interlocutors in Germany. They could have gotten it from him, and then because the population in Europe doesn't have as much natural immunity to malaria, it could have spread. This is just a hypothetical. But this hypothetical tells you how short-sighted cutting health, especially. I mean, you can cut education. So this is me now trying to be brutal, ruthless in
I
this
was about to say provocative.
provocative, whatever language you want to use. You can cut education with the aim of creating a permanent underclass that will always that you can always draw on to do your menial jobs. There are people who actually think like that. That if we deprive so and so areas of education, we will create a permanent underclass who will always serve our children. Nigerian politicians do that. So you can, if you want to be absolutely feudal, you can do that. But the one thing that it is short-sighted to do is cut health, because if we go back 400, 500, 400, 500 years. This is 400, is more than about 800 years, 700, 800 years. The Black Death. Or come back to 5 years ago, COVID. Did COVID or the Black Death respect elite status? No. Parasites, bacteria, pathogens do not know the difference between Keir Starmer and Ndukwe Onoha. What they know is human being that I can feed off on. So it is absolutely short-sighted to be cutting health budgets. Absolutely short-sighted. And again, going back, COVID just provides us the perfect example. Western countries bought up all the vaccines. Take a look at the table of countries where people died. Who are the countries at the top? Western countries. They expected a majority of the deaths from COVID to be in African countries. African countries ended up being at the bottom of the list of the league table of deaths from COVID.
Is this where our prayers came in?
No,
No. I'm
okay.
just prodding. But Jetta, but here's the other side of the equation. When you look at the spend by some African countries on things like presidential jets and presidential luxuries running into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And you compare this to how much they could have spent in, say, malaria medication, which is said to cost Africa an estimated $12 billion a year in direct costs and lost productivity. The question will be, shouldn't these be, and this is me playing the devil's advocate, but shouldn't news like this make African leaders sort of like look inward and say we cannot depend entirely on foreign aid? Because remember, part of the reason why a lot of these cuts to foreign development office is because Trump is insisting that NATO countries up their defense spending. So if they've looked at every other thing and they've said, well, in the one place that, again, when you come back to the influence of the impact on citizens, won't, in quotes, have a direct impact on our citizens, and where these other countries have the choice of either splurging on the latest presidential plane, or in someone's case, a presidential yacht.
Not just plane, yachts, very large convoy. I mean, to put it bluntly, earlier this year, earlier this year, I was on the main route going into Abuja from the airport. I missed 2 meetings because Tinubu's convoy was passing. I had nothing better to do since we were sitting in traffic and watching his convoy pass. So I counted. There were 102 cars in the convoy. It was over 100.
Now,
So
one of those vehicles, I am sure, because they're not going to be your random run-of-the-mill small
there were 3
2,000 pound.
ambulances.
So one of those vehicles could have funded healthcare in a small
Yes.
community.
Again, I completely agree with you. And yes, African leaders, look at the nonsense happening in Cameroon right now, for example, or look at the fact that just a few weeks ago, I was on the route from Ziguinchor to Bissau, 100, and this is in Guinea-Bissau. The 147 kilometers took us 6 hours, 7 hours. So we're basically moving at 20 kilometers per hour, because of the quality of the routes. Yes, that argument is a very, very decent and true argument. But it brings another question: Western complicity. And I really don't like pushing a lot of these things to Western people, but it has to be said. Western complicity in aiding recalcitrant African leaders. So, as an example, how many Western leaders have told Tinubu to his face that we will stop the funding if you don't stop this opulent lifestyle? How many Western leaders have told Paul Biya that he should go back to his country and live with his people rather than living in Switzerland or France? Because Paul Biya, take the Cameroon elections that's happened just a few days ago. Paul Biya only bothers to show up in the country to campaign 4 days before the start of the election. And we're recording this on Tuesday. The results are going to be announced on Thursday. They
had to give it time to just.
Of course, they gave it time to cook. The opposition leader has already declared himself winner, and the head of the Electoral Commission has come out to tell him to shut up. So essentially, they've set Cameroon up for more trouble because the country is already troubled. They've set the country up for more trouble, and I have not seen or heard any Western leader condemn Biya. So there's a rule. Basically, your actions or inactions destabilize countries in the global south. And then when people run from the mess that you have helped create, because yes, our leaders are not innocent bystanders in this mess, and a lot of our people are not innocent bystanders. But when people run from the mess you've created or you've helped to create, you turn around and start moaning about immigrants. It's problematic all around.
Okay, Cheta, on that note, let's go for a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive more into just what these funds do or do not do.
No wahala.
Welcome back to the Black Paper. My name is Ndukwe Onoha.
And I'm Cheta Wanze.
Cheta, in the first half of this episode, we spoke broadly about the cut or the proposed cut by the UK government to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria. But now I want to delve into one of the arguments that are often made by people who do not support this move, which is the apparent loss of or watering down of the UK soft power by doing this. My question then would be, is soft power a euphemism for the UK's ability or any country's ability really to have some form of unfettered access to and influence in Africa and African countries? And just a few examples. In Burkina Faso, for instance, the military government in October arrested 8 workers from the Netherlands-based NGO, International NGO Safety Organization. And the allegation was that they collected and passed sensitive security information, sort of like military zones, convoy routes, personal numbers to foreign entities. Um, you've had accusations by different in Nigeria, for instance. You've had accusations by the army that these NGOs were fronts,
We're helping Boko Haram.
were helping Boko Haram. Now, but even if it sounds like it's just the Africans who are complaining, remember in the US, one of the things that Trump, or one of the excuses or reasons Trump gave when cutting funds were that
To
this
USAID.
guy to USAID was that they were doing anything but aiding. So is soft power a euphemism for this is the new do I want to say spying ring, or do I want to say sensitive data collection outpost?
Yes, in a way. So I think we want to define soft power first. There are two broad kinds of power. There's hard power, which is military force and all of that, and then there's soft power. So soft power has always had its place, and one of the best examples of soft power use is Hollywood. Basically, propaganda. The Hollywood is probably the best. It, it's the best. It's the best example of the use of soft power. But you have journalists. In the past, you've had people like, for example, Kim Philby, or T.E. Lawrence, or Saint John Philby, that's Kim Philby's father, who were journalists that moved in freely, basically writing stories in various countries, but also giving information to intelligence services. In Kim Philby's case, he was actually part of the intelligence services and did journalism as a cover. You've had health workers you've even had religious. So there's current, at the moment, there's a sort of storm between China and the US because the Chinese have literally accused some American pastors of being spies. So the soft power moves, for example, health services, educational exchanges, developmental aid, and even sports have been used as cover for nefarious activities. I mean, there's the accusation, for example, that Chinese Confucius institutes have been used as cover for Chinese spies. And back during the Cold War, once you heard somebody was a cultural attaché in an embassy, whether from the East Bloc or from the West Bloc, almost immediately you would know that this person was nefarious. So there's that soft power thing. But at the end of the day, a key fact is this: given the, and I hate to use the word, but it's the only word, given the uselessness or the general uselessness of our home governments in Africa, we don't have too much of a choice but to bend to this soft power. And what the what the UK is doing is deliberately setting a thought on its soft power reach. And this health cutting again, I'm at pains to stress this is the second time they are cutting UK contribution to the Global Health Fund. The cuts is just the latest. It started with the BBC. The BBC used to be the most potent symbol of UK soft power. Because, I mean, think of the Second World War when almost all the resistance groups in Europe against the Nazis, against the German Nazis, used to listen to the BBC. Now, the UK government has cut so many BBC services. For example, I think they've cut, is it BBC Hindi or BBC Arabic, at a time when Arabic is becoming even more important. It's already a global language, but it's becoming more important. I'm at pains that if there are four languages outside of English that my kids should learn, it should be Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, and Spanish. Um, it pains me
This is
that
interesting. Why?
these are the language so these five languages: English, of course;
Mm,
Spanish, because of Latin America; Arabic, because pretty much anywhere you are in the Muslim world, you can get by with some Arabic;
mm,
Russian, because whether you like it or not, there's an entire block. Once you cross the border from Germany into Poland, you will get people who understand Russian. And Russia is 11 time zones. This is going all the way to Vladivostok. And Russia still maintains a huge cultural footprint. Then Mandarin, Chinese, that's going to be the language of manufacturing. I think it's now more than 50% of research papers that are published by people in China. Naturally, their language will become more important in the sciences. French, maybe you can add French as a subsidiary, not because of France, but because of Africa. I mean,
the
I would,
francophone
yeah, I
countries.
would give the example of the fact that if I didn't have some French, my work would not be possible. Going to places like Senegal, Togo, the Ivory Coast on a
So,
regular basis. So
so
some French.
tu parles français,
Je parlais français un peu.
and that is the end of my French. Carry on.
So French is useful. I mean, from a Nigerian perspective, it's a travesty that we don't make French and Hausa compulsory in schools in Nigeria. And I mean, I once said on Smooth FM that all Nigerian children should be taught Hausa. And the reaction that day during Lagos talks, it was the first time I saw Yoruba and Igbo people agreeing comprehensively on something.
Mm,
They were all
mm.
they were all insulting my mother that she didn't train me properly. That's how can I say all their children should learn Hausa? But it is actually very important. In West Africa, Hausa and French are two languages that you should know. Anyway, back to what we're talking. We're talking of soft power, and when the UK steps back from its traditional soft power position, it creates gaps that its adversaries, I'm not going to say bad guys, because again, I'm a geopolitical analyst. And in geopolitics, you don't really have bad guys. Every once in a while, you have genuinely evil guys. The last set of genuinely evil guys were the Nazis. That's on a global scale. Of course, you have little pockets here and there. All the evil guys, the guys that have been called evil since then, evil empire, the Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein, they are just people who are opposed to the Western narrative. As Donald Trump so eloquently said during his first term, we have also done bad stuff. So all of that is narratives. When the UK steps back from its soft power pedestal, its adversaries, such as China and Russia, will fill in the gap. So you can see in West Africa, France was kicked out. Not France didn't. Was kicked out without dignity. They went screaming and shouting. But a
And now
vacuum
they're
was
trying to come. Now they're trying to come back in through Nigeria. But carry on.
that's a complicated discussion because you are
No, sorry.
tempting me to go
Don't
into
let me.
something that okay,
Don't let me
okay,
derail you. Don't let me derail you.
okay. So when the UK or when Western countries step back from that soft power pedestal, which they have been, so they are doing it deliberately because of short-sightedness. And I think I've said on this podcast before that a big problem that many Western countries have is that the quality of their political class has become increasingly worse. It's
And I think sorry, Chikos, but I think what's even more worrying is that people are thinking in terms of next of election cycles.
Yes, we've trashed this out in a previous
Yes,
episode.
yes.
People no longer think long term; they just think in terms of the next election. It's one of the reasons why polling has become very important. Because, as an example, if I were in your party right now, I'm not talking of Jeremy Corbyn's your party. I'm talking of the Labour Party.
I walked into that.
I wouldn't be looking at the current polls that are putting reform at a high level, because simple and short, it is my view that reform has peaked too early. Instead, I would focus on the real problem that is driving people towards reform, which is the cost of living crisis. But no, instead, you are hearing silliness such as, oh, immigrants must have A-level English. And you ask yourself, how many people in the UK have A-level English? Is community not about being able to make yourself understood and make and understand what people are saying? There are people from India, from Pakistan, from Nigeria who have A levels but don't speak English. So what are you on about? But again, that's besides the point. The point is, when you walk away from soft power, from a very strong soft power position, there is a vacuum created. Basic maxim: nature abhors a vacuum. So somebody will walk in and fill that vacuum. And we've just said the big winner in all of this: China.
Yeah, in fact, when you talk about China, they probably have one of the hardest soft power examples ever. The African Union building, built for what, about $200 million, and
That,
then
that's not
packed
even
full.
that's so
No, no.
you want to
So
talk about the box thing and all
the
of that.
box, and I'm like, that is. And I'm so here's the thing, and this might sound controversial. I don't begrudge them that. Sadly,
There's nothing
in
to
international
begrudge, and
relations,
I can
the game
assure
is the
you,
game.
Ndukwe, there's nothing to begrudge, and I can assure you that within a few months, the Chinese would have realized that all those bugs were useless, because there is nothing. The African Union.
Oh
I
my
think I have
goodness,
to be very careful here
Cheta.
before my boss phones me to scream about losing potential jobs for the organization. The African Union, ECOWAS, they are not very effective. Let's end it there. Yeah. But the real Chinese soft/hard power actually comes in their people. So I'll give an example. There was a time that in their people, there was a time that myself and some of my colleagues were in Sokoto. Mhm. And we were in our restaurant and we're having lunch. And there were these four Chinese guys on the table next to us talking to each other. And suddenly we realized that we were hearing what they were saying. They were speaking to each other and they were not speaking in English, but we're hearing what they were saying. Guess what language they were conversing with each other in?
Hausa?
They were speaking in Hausa. And it was a shock to us, like, what is happening here? And it takes me back to the foundations of British soft power. People like Frederick Lugard. I really hated that guy. Or I really hate that guy, but that's another discussion entirely. Lugard made sure that all the British people that were posted to Nigeria learned Hausa. It was a requirement. So you could, both of us are Igbo guys. The the first the first person who wrote Igbo down as a language was Samuel Ajayi Crowther. But let me rephrase. The first person who wrote Igbo in Latin scripts, because we had our own native scripts and CBG,
We had in Sweden.
which sadly is lost, sadly is lost.
Well, there are pockets, and there's renaissance, but there are pockets of people who still hold that institutional memory. And
Well,
uh,
we need to find them and bring out that knowledge. But again, that's beyond this discussion. The point is, after Samuel Ajayi Crowther, the next person who did most of the work in putting down the Igbo language in Latin script was T.E. Dennis, a British guy. A lot of, Bishop Kelly, late now, spoke Igbo far better than I ever will. He was Irish. So increasingly, you find that the number of Europeans, and there was an American diplomat complained about this to me once, that they went for meetings somewhere, they were kept waiting. This was in another African country, which I will not name. He was he was brought into that trip from Nigeria. He was at the time he was stationed in Nigeria, but he was brought into that trip because he spoke French. They got to the meeting. The rest of his party, who had come in from DC, none of them spoke French. They asked him to join them from Lagos because of his French. Only for them to get there, he's acting as an interpreter, as translator for his people. The Chinese guys who were there before them were speaking Bambara. So as in he admitted they had lost before they even started because of and that is the classic example of soft power. You go to there was a job that we did once upon a time in a place called Udabo in Kogi. There were Chinese people in Udabo. I said, even me, a Nigerian, will find it hard to leave the comfort and quote of Lagos to move to Udabo. There were Chinese people living there. And I saw the same thing recently in both Senegal and in Guinea-Bissau. Chinese people living, I won't use the word on the street, but you get the point.
Mm.
Whereas when Europeans come to these countries, or when when Westerners come to these countries, they want to stay in Ikoyi or Banana Island.
And the thing is, I mean, because you've talked about China a lot, but interestingly, it's not just China who's filling in these gaps. You've had Russia, give like in Central African Republic.
Go on.
In Central African Republic, for instance, 50,000 tons of grains to buffer a loss from the UK's.
So you're actually feeding into what I wanted to say. The Russian involvement is largely in two ways.
You have Saudi Arabia. Yeah,
now,
you have Saudi Arabia.
Countries,
you have Iran. So the
Saudi
thing
Arabia,
is,
Iran, and the UAE.
And
Qatar.
So what you have is a silent withdrawing of
the geopolitical map.
Of the geopolitical map. And it's interesting because you don't just see this or rather one of the biggest pointers to this is when Nigerian athletes suddenly start representing some of these countries, and you're like, hang on, how do you go from Lagos to Bahrain? How did that happen? So you see that, and I bring this up because normally you could always look at migratory patterns and project where people from certain countries would choose to migrate to. So if you're from the Anglophone countries in West Africa, for instance, you will come to places like obviously the UK, or you go to US, you go to other English-speaking common or former Commonwealth countries. If you were from the Francophone countries, you would go obviously to France. However, we are suddenly seeing people from the Anglophone countries, from Francophone countries, going to make their home in
the Middle East.
In the Middle East, and then you're wondering,
Turkey. So, for example, Favor Fini has just become Turkish. Has just picked up a Turkish passport. She was one of Nigeria's best prospects for the 100 and 200 meters. Emmanuel Bamidele has picked up an Emirati passport and I think it's 400 meters. The one that pains me the most is Ibili Abapong, who is now running under Sawa Eid Nassar for Bahrain. But yes, it makes the points. Basically, there's a shift in migratory patterns, and part of it is.
Sorry, because I'm always conscious that we don't always just give Nigerian examples so that it doesn't look like what these two Nigerian guys are doing, what these Nigerians do again. But you have people like Winfred Yavi, who's switched from Kenya to Bahrain. You have Tariq Mubarak Taher, who's of course from Kenya again, but Bahrain is just snatching up a lot of people. Maybe we should start this podcast in Bahrain, Cheta.
Well, maybe, but again, I think the broader point is there's a shift in migratory patterns, for the simple fact that there's a hostility coming from the West and people can see it. The attraction that Western countries have always had is historical because of colonialism. So you and I, 100 years ago, 100 years ago is 1925. So by that time, Nigeria was already existed. So 150 years ago, you and I would have, although my own dialect, you and I would not have identified as an Igbo. You would have identified as an Abriba person. I would have identified as an Onitsha person. But 100 years ago, 150 years ago, would have had a common language to interact with each other than English. Then George Goldie and his menagerie, Flora Shaw, Lugard, and the rest came and imposed English on us. Our common language is English now, but there's a hostility coming from England that is making a lot of our people. So England, the United States, Canada, Australia are still very much the first choice for people when they want to migrate. Again, because of language. But increasingly, our people are looking in other directions because of hostility. And my own argument is it's the loss of the West. Because when you look at a map of fertility, and people are needed for economies to keep running. When you look at a map of fertility, the high growth areas are areas from our part of the world, the global south. So what happens, and the first sector that will be hit bigly is the care sector. In 10 years, when you have more people having to, when you have an even greater number of people than they have now who have retired and need care, are you suddenly going to turn around? People forget that memories can be long. And at the same time, memories can be long. People forget that even these other countries, the Chinas, the Arab countries, also have aging populations. So the competition will be more intense, and you are touching your soft power. It's short-sighted.
It is short-sighted. And I think this is one of those occasions where rather than talk about what our communities should do, because we're already doing as much as we can in terms of bridging the gap between the loss of funds and the need for care. So to everyone who's sending money back home, taking care of families and just helping with those needs, well done you, God bless you. Rather, what I would say, is to echo your words, Cheta, to not just the UK government, but to all these other governments um that deliberate or are cutting these aids because somehow people are thinking of the next election rather than a long term. What you're doing is helping fast forward a change in the global order where just like what was done with Brexit, where the UK decided it was going to pull out of a stronger union to make itself, sadly, considerably weaker. What you're doing is set yourselves up for a much smaller role in the global on the global stage by ensuring that allegiances of other allegiances are formed because you've left a space that, and as we've said, and as is common knowledge, nature abhors a vacuum. This has to be retaught, not because it's just giving free money to some. Of course, what needs to be done is streamline or means test how these funds are released, because yes, the allegations of countries and people mismanaging these funds are real and cannot be.
Not allegations.
Oh well. They cannot be overlooked. But rather than just say we're going to cut our nose to spite our face, look at how these funds can be properly managed. But if you still want to play an important part on the world stage, the best way to do that is not by handing the baton over to your competition, because they will fill those spaces, and you will find out that in 20-30 years you're playing from a place of weakness rather than strength.
I have nothing to add for once. You have said everything that I wanted. In short, I think you stole my scripts.
I did. As we were talking, I was just sort of like looking in. But anyway, Cheta, thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you at the next one.
See you next week.